What is up, everybody? I'm NoLucksGiven here with your afternoon snap, and today we're going to be breaking down the top 8 and overall metagame from this week's Community Gaming SEA tournament. Oh yeah, and before I forget, this season I'm also doing a giveaway on my channel where any comment, as long as you are subscribed, enters you in a chance to win premium mystery variants, credits, and gold. The data was compiled for me thanks to Snapster Indonesia. If you're not already following them, make sure you do so, as well as giving a follow to yours truly. But they compiled all this data, took a lot of the legwork from me, and now I can talk about all of the sweet stuff from this event. So they did post some conclusions themselves. We are definitely going to hit on these bullet points, but first, let's just take a look at the top 8 overview here. We've got 2 Silver Surfer lists, 2 Ravona lists, a Bounce Monkey, a Thanos, a Blink Sandwave list, and a Supergiant list. Interesting, Supergiant, not a card that we typically see in these tournaments, not a card that I typically really even think of in Marvel Snap. In fact, I'm not even sure if I own Supergiant, just because it's really a card that I do not consider playing that often. It probably means that I don't own it, but Supergiant actually won this entire event. We're going to take a look at that list in just a moment, but some other things here to mention. 2 different Fastos decks. Really cool. We're going to look at both of those as well. One of those is the Silver Surfer, one is the Thanos, so we get a little bit of a variety in that. And then also No Loki, which I think is really interesting to note, and we're going to look at the metagame overall, like I said, in just a moment. But first, let's look at these top 8 lists. So this was the first place list, Claire with Supergiant Control, and they're calling it Supergiant Control because there's a decent amount of tech cards in here, more tech cards than some of the other lists, and some unique tech cards that we don't always see. Negasonic Teenage Warhead definitely being among them. I would say Shadow King Cosmo, Red Guardian Nocturne, and White Widow sort of being a control card. It's kind of a junk card, but junk is a sort of control as well. This is like the core disruption of the deck, with Supergiant sometimes fueling your ability to disrupt your opponent because it allows you to play these cards on turn 5, not take priority, and still surprise your opponent with a bunch of reactive cards on the final turn. Negasonic Teenage Warhead, though, is a card that we really don't see a lot of, and I was actually thinking about doing a video of it like a month ago. I just had like a YouTube short basically comparing this card to Alioth, which has really not seen any play since it was nerfed. And Negasonic Teenage Warhead, I think, is just a much better Alioth as the cards currently sit in Marvel Snap. That might change, but as the game currently sits, Negasonic Teenage Warhead is just so much cheaper than Alioth, and destroying your opponent's card is generally better than just removing the on-reveal abilities from it. So Negasonic Teenage Warhead can definitely mess with your opponent. You like Cosmo a location and then Warhead a location, and your opponent is kind of at odds for what they can do. Shadow King, really strong right now, and just in general, 2 cost, really powerful effect for that 2 cost. And Red Guardian, I described the other day as the best card that I didn't own, but I got it in Spotlight Caches this week. Red Guardian is really cool. Claw is kind of an interesting one, just being a lot of power since it was buffed recently, but I'm kind of building to Squirrel Girl, which I think is really, really fun. So Squirrel Girl does a few things in this deck. One, Squirrel Girl kind of just like puts you over the top. It's funny because Squirrel Girl is one of the first cards that you get in Marvel Snap very early on, and it's very good. People forget, like, Squirrel Girl can just, okay, Sanctum Sanctorum's in the game. You can win with Squirrel Girl if there's like lockdown location, surprise your opponent by getting a little bit more power there. And if we're getting to a point where everyone is playing Jeff, which Jeff's numbers have gone down a little bit the past 2-3 weeks, but still, if everybody's playing Jeff, then you're just tying locations like Sanctum Sanctorum where both of you play a Jeff there, right? But With Squirrel Girl, kind of get to go over the top in a really silly way, but that's really not why it's being played in this deck. Claw kind of fills that role much better, assuming that the first location isn't that Sanctum Sanctorum. But Squirrel Girl is actually just here to make Mockingbird cheaper. It's the only card in this deck that is fueling out a cheaper Mockingbird. And it's really interesting to just see Squirrel Girl. We see it here because it is specifically just cheaper than Mysterio. It's actually the same amount of power as Mysterio, 4 power total on the squirrels and 4 power on the real Mysterio, not counting the clones. It's not going to give you as big of a discount as Mysterio though, but it is a lot cheaper. So you're paying less total for your Mockingbird. Actually you're paying the same amount, right? Because Mysterio is 2 plus 2 for the Mockingbird, whereas Squirrel Girl is 1 plus 3. So overall, you're still paying for energy. You're still getting the same amount of total power here, actually, and that is the full commitment, the least commitment possible for Mockingbird. I do want to point out that if your opponents have White Widow, then you do get Mockingbird a little bit cheaper from that. And then of course there's locations that can give you cards that didn't start in your deck, and Nocturne potentially creating more locations like that can be synergistic, but for the most part this deck is just leaning on Squirrel Girl plus Mockingbird as a sort of synergy that is not like super exciting, but can definitely bring the power. It's also dodging most tech cards. It's not going to dodge Killmonger, but it is going to dodge Shadow King Shang-Chi, because Mockingbird just starts with that base 9 power and also will dodge like Rogue, Enchantress, things like that. Plus Sage on top of it all, that is another reason to just make sure you've got at least one cost card in your deck in case your opponent doesn't. And we can see a pretty solid curve, like we've got cards of every single cost other than 6. So Sage can definitely do it. Sage has definitely been a surprising powerhouse from my perspective. Like, I was not expecting it to just be as dominant. This is a list without Ravonna, and we're still seeing Sage do some work here. So I also want to look at, like, it's kind of good to look at this deck first. Sometimes I will build up from like the 4th place deck all the way up to the 1st place deck. But in this video, I wanted to look at this deck first because I want to keep these cards in mind. Shadow King, Negasonic, Supergiant, even Claw, and then Nocturne, Red Guardian, Cosmo, as well as potentially the White Widow, just to see, like, against the other decks, which of these cards are going to be good. And that sends me into the 2nd place list. We will get back to those other lists in due time, but we've got Phastos Silver Surfer, which is definitely, I think, going to be a big home for Phastos. I think that this deck is really, really strong. So there's a few things going on here that I think are pretty important to talk about. And I think that when I first saw Phastos, this was the combo that I thought of. Phastos, Hope Summers, Silver Surfer, and then honestly, Brood and Sebastian Shaw and Absorbing Man. I think that's the core of the deck, those 6 cards. And then from there is a little bit of room to tech out the deck. We see some ways to get additional power, and then 3 tech slots in this Silver Surfer list, and then Mockingbird on top. Mockingbird, just a solid card, making it a 3/9 with Brood is just like good enough. It won't be a 3/9 in that Silver Surfer can pump it up, but it will still be 9 power for 3 energy, maybe even less if you get that Absorbing Man in here. So, Phastos, really strong in these Silver Surfer lists, because obviously if you hit Brood or Sebastian Shaw, you're getting even more value for your Phastos. However, there's also a lot of value to be had in specific curves with Hope Summers. Oh, and you can also Absorbing Man the Phastos. I showed that off in my Phastos video on release day. Yeah, yesterday. Fastos just came out yesterday and is already putting 2 copies in the top 8 of this tournament. So I definitely think that this is a real card. You're welcome to hold off until the weekend and get a little bit more information on your decisions. But as long as you've got the keys to spare, I don't think you're going to regret picking up Fastos. I think that it is pretty strong, and like the pun I kind of made the other day, we're seeing results from it very fast-os. But specifically with Hope Summers, I think that it lends a lot of really interesting curves to these Silver Surfer lists. You can play turn 3 Hope Summers, turn 4 play any card on it, and then turn 5 be able to drop 2 3-cost cards. That was already a curve that was available in these Silver Surfer lists with Hope without Sarah. But now with Fastos, you additionally have potential curves where you go turn 3 Fastos, turn 4 any 3-cost card, turn 4 turn 5 rather, if you drew any reduced cost card with Fastos, you can play that plus any other 3-cost card on the 5th turn as well. So I think that that just leads a lot of versatile curves with your Fastos Silver Surfer list, and in conjunction with Hope Summers, you go potentially, there's 2 ways to curve it. You can go same thing, turn 3 Hope, turn 4 Fastos onto Hope, turn 5 2 3s, or you can go turn 3 Fastos, turn 4 Hope, turn 5 onto Hope, play a 3-cost card and a 2-cost card reduced by Fastos, or potentially Forge, but ideally reduced by Fastos 3-cost card, both onto Hope Summers. That gives you 8 energy for the final turn of the game, which allows you to play 2 3-cost cards plus an additional 3-cost card that had its cost reduced by Fastos. So I think that there's just a lot of flexibility in how this deck can curve out. Some of those things are going to get hounded by Mobius, and I do think that Mobius is a pretty good pick this week, both in Silver Surfer decks and against them, because Silver Surfer decks are now looking to pump things up with Fastos. But I think the risk in playing Fastos is still worth it because the reward is definitely there. Your opponent might not always have Mobius. This deck does not have any ways to deal with Mobius, no Lady Deathstrike or, Rogue. But we talked about why Rogue isn't super strong last week. There's no huge targets right now that it wants to hit in theory. However, now there is a big target for Rogue to hit, and that is Iron Man. Iron Man puts 2 copies into the top 8 this week, one in this Bounce Monkey list, and then another one that we will look at in just a moment. But Iron Man here with Bast is obviously very strong. This list leans pretty heavily on Angela, Elsa just being like a really strong thing that you can do. I should also say, I'm not 100% positive. I did not double check myself to see if this list got 3rd or 4th in the event, so apologies for that, MRHY. But either way, a top 4 finish here for Bounce Monkey. I don't have too much to say on this list other than Angela is pretty good right now, so play it while you can. I think that there's been some leaks that say Angela is getting nerfed tomorrow, so I think that, you know, I can't really speak on those things exactly, but yeah, I think that Angela has definitely had its time to shine, and Iron Man is definitely a cool addition. We've seen it in the other list we're going to see the Iron Man in, rather, is in a Ravonna list up here. We'll get to that in just a moment, but yeah, both of these decks kind of like making a better Iron Man, which is always kind of funny because Iron Man is one of the most despite being a 0 power card, it's one of the highest potential outputs for power to cost ratios in the game, but we always see it alongside Mr. Negative and Bast and Ravonna to just make that ratio even better. But here we're pumping up the Iron Man with Bast. And then similar combos that we've seen before, Hitmonkey plus Mysterio on the final turn of the game, it can be pretty good. And both of these, it's funny, like I've just been seeing Iron Man in general a lot more recently, and yeah, I got like Moon Girl Iron Man the other day. That was kind of crazy, but people just recognizing that like at the top of the curve, this is really good. A lot of people aren't hating on it specifically right now. Enchantress and Rogue were pretty terrible cards last week, so we're seeing that those are not really, probably going to see that those cards are not really represented in the metagame this week, which leaves an open spot for people to Iron Man game the system here. Another card that we have not seen in a little bit is Blink. We've got a Blink Sandwave list here with Wave and Electro and Jubilee, as well as Blink to cheat out some of these really big cards. Leech makes a return as well. So what's really interesting about this top 8, and I'm going to zoom out for a second here, get all of these deck lists on screen. So last week, a commenter pointed out one thing that I forgot to say in the video. Part of the success last week of all of those Phoenix Force lists is Phoenix Force is really, really good against Loki, because you were playing these hyper synergistic cards that really punish Loki for like stealing part of your combo but not all of your combo. This week we see a bunch of just like decks with a lot of really good cards in them. I will say the caveat here is the Angela deck, which Loki decks can have a little bit of trouble because you don't get as many turns to set up with Angela and Kitty Pryde, but still Hitmonkey is like bonkers with Loki, and Iron Man getting a 4-0 Loki, we already talked about how good that is. But across the board, I would say that these decks are more good stuff focus, especially the winning deck from Claire. I should not cut Claire's name off here because they won the whole dang event. So, yeah, a lot more decks that you would think Loki could prey on, and that's part of the reason I have to think that we weren't seeing Blink for a little bit. Also, Leech getting moved around and stuff was not great for Blink, but Leech is still great. We can see that the first deck, of course, won with Cosmo, and there's definitely a lot of on-reveal stuff going on across the board, and we're going to talk about Cosmo specifically in a moment when we get to the metagame breakdown. But yeah, a return for Blink I think is pretty cool to see. I don't want this deck to be like everywhere because it kind of cheats some of the fundamental aspects of Marvel Snap when you were just ramping. Ramp can just be like a really broken thing in games like this, but everybody's ramping. We're all ramping a little bit here with our Fastos and Hope Summers and stuff. And a cool return here for Blink. Definitely a strong list here. Nothing super crazy to say about it, I'll say, because it's pretty straightforward, but it is cool to see like Ultron in this list. Like Ultron alongside Orca, they're really just trying to play like most bang for your buck cards and have them be useful in like a variety of different situations. But Jubilee into Ultron could potentially get you, so watch out for that. And then we also have Blob, which is really strong here, being able to eat up a bunch of expensive and powerful cards. Let's take a look at the rest of the top 8 here before we get into the metagame as a whole. We've got Ravonna, good stuff they're calling it. Ravonna with Angela, Athena, Morph, which I have been seeing a little bit of. Let me not cut off Ionathan's name here. Morph Ravonna I think is really, really cool though, because Morph is just like, honestly, probably a little bit underplayed, and getting it out for just 2 energy I think is really fantastic. Juggernaut makes a showing here as a nice little tech card. When people aren't expecting Juggernaut, it's pretty good. I do want to reiterate that this was an open list tournament, so all of Ionathan's opponents knew about the Juggernaut, which I think just speaks to like how strong it is even so, because It's stronger on ladder when your opponents don't know about it. Here, all of Ionathan's opponents knew about it, but it was still able to get some stuff done for them. So, pretty cool. And then we also have Mysterio Mockingbird combo with Mysterio Sasquatch combo as well. So fun stuff there. This is definitely a list that I wanted to talk about a little bit though. Thanos with Fastos. So I do think that this is really strong. It's a really good place to slot Fastos into because, so just some kind of like interesting things about Fastos to consider. It is disproportionately stronger when it is affecting cheaper cards. And the reason for that is, say you make a 6-cost card cost 1 less. You have made the card, or you know what, for simplicity's sake, let's say a 5-cost card, because that's an easier fraction. If you make a 5-cost card cost 4, you've made it cost 20% less. If you make a 2-cost card cost 1, you have made it cost 50% less. So obviously, the more cheaper cards you have in your deck, the better a Fastos can be. And when you were giving those discounts to stones, you were giving them a 100% discount, other than Mind Stone, which is just a 50% discount. And on the other side of that, let's look at Vision. If you pumped up a Vision, you were giving it a 20% increase in stats. If you give Jeff +2, you are giving it a 66% increase in stats. Same thing for many of the stones, some of the stones getting a 200% increase. So all of that is just to say Fastos is really, really good with the stones just for that basic math, but also really good with the stones because all of the stones, or most of the stones, draw you a card or multiple cards, which means that you are getting to see more of your deck, which is like a really important, it's kind of hard to just put that in simple math terms, but every card that you draw after playing Fastos means that you are seeing more of his impact. I think all of that tracks pretty well. So Fastos is just really, really good alongside Thanos' stones. It also gives you just like bigger blobs, which is cool. And of course, a bigger Gilgamesh, which we see up at the top of the curve here alongside Blue Marvel to pump up your team. And in acknowledgement that the stones are really good in this specific list, we also see a Chimera to protect them from Killmonger. We did see a Killmonger in the Silver Surfer list right here, which I didn't actually talk about too much, but part of the reason, so this isn't necessarily card for card how I might build a Silver Surfer Fastos list. However, for this tournament, it's a pretty reasonable metagame call. Last week we saw Phoenix Force put 3 copies in the top 8, and I said in last week's video, I think we need to see a little more Killmonger next week to keep these, Human Torches in check, because Human Torch can just get absolutely bonkers in that deck, and not enough people were playing Killmonger to keep those at bay. So that is why we see the Killmonger here in this Silver Surfer list, a little bit of tech alongside that Mobius, which we also see in the Thanos. It's funny, the 2 players playing Fastos are also the 2 players playing Mobius in the top 8, because those are the ones that respect the power of Fastos and try to metagame against it. Mockingbird is, of course, really, really powerful with the stones, and I already talked about Blob being even better in a Fastos Thanos list. So, really cool list, and I think that if you've got the Gilgamesh, this is definitely a list that you can check out. Even if you don't have Gilgamesh though, I think that Thanos Fastos is still a combination worthy of playing, and just because I really like Thanos, it was one of the first places that my mind went to when I saw Fastos, but the math really backs it up there, and hopefully I broke all of that down well enough for you. We do have another Silver Surfer list, again with Killmonger, this time a pretty classic Silver Surfer list, really leaning into Sebastian Shaw and Brood and trying to pump them in a variety of ways, like almost too many ways, to be honest, with Nova Killmonger, America randomly hitting them, Forge, Nakia, Okoye, and Ironheart, as well as Silver Surfer, Absorbing Man. So I think that this list is like a little bit old school, and especially with Sarah in it, I think that you can afford to make your curve a little bit higher and include some tech, cut some variety of these cards here for Mobius or other interesting tech cards. And I think that Phastos is probably worth trying to include in here as well if you open for it, and obviously not everybody has the new cards the week that they release, but it is still worth just highlighting the fact that we have not seen Silver Surfer really put any numbers. There's been like some of these past few weeks, like I'm saying, this is an old school list. This list has been playable for since Sebastian Shaw released at this point. So this list has been playable for 6 months at this point. But for like the past 2 months, there's been tournaments where there's been 0 copies of Silver Surfer in the top 8, or I'm sorry, in the entire tournament. So now we are finally seeing some players play Silver Surfer, and yeah, it's doing well. And I think that there's ways to optimize on this list further, but the fact that this list is putting up numbers even without those optimizations is obviously quite great. And we also have Ravonna to round it out, another Ravonna list that leans heavily into it with Angela, Green Goblin, and Sage. Actually, I take that back. This list does not lean that heavily into it with just those 3 cards. I think that, oh yeah, and Thena. But I think that the other Ravonna list here actually has a much higher lean with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cards. Okay, so a little bit of a higher lean, but there is the full top 8. I will zoom out here to get it all on screen one final time. And just as a reminder for this layout, if you check this image out yourself, in the top 8, these decks played against each other horizontally. So Supergiant beat Ravonna, Bounce Monkey beat Thanos, etc. And then in the top 4, they played vertically. So Supergiant beat Bounce Monkey, Blink, Sand Ramp beat the Surfer Phastos list. So just a short little breakdown there, and let's look at the metagame now as a whole. You can find a link to this data in the video description as well, but I wanted to break down a few things that I thought were interesting here and just kind of play around with it. So one huge thing, top story right now, is that Jeff the Baby Landshark, for the first time in months, is not the most played card in this tournament. That is instead going to go to Shang-Chi, which was previously on top before getting the throne usurped by Jeff. And we can see based on these win rates that honestly Jeff probably deserves the top spot. If you sort by games seen, then Jeff is still on top. So with the win rate factored in, I think that Jeff is still the top card in Marvel Snap, but just interesting, a little bit more players choosing to play Shang-Chi this go round. One thing that I immediately wanted to check out, because I forgot to do it last week, oh, it's right here. Phastos, 11 copies played. Negative win rate, below 50% win rate. But yeah, that is possibly the most represented a card has been the first week it is available. And then I also wanted to see Makari. Okay, yeah, 1 copy of Makari across the entire tournament, and they went 1-1 with it. Fair enough. I did not, the reason I said I wanted to look at that is at the top is I did not look at Makari last week. This is last week's data, and oh, wow. Okay, there was only 1 copy of Makari last week as well. It just happened to go 3-1. All right, fair enough. But back to this week's data, we can see that Sage is probably the I mean, it's the first that gives like a little bit of a green colored background here, kind of a puke color, but it stands out as the first card that's like above 60%, other than Nocturne, which has a pretty high win rate as well at exactly 60%. But Sage just standing out here just from the color differentiator. There's other cards with higher win rates, but Sage, like I said, I definitely slept on it. But Brood, also above 60%. This is a card I've been playing a ton of. I think that Brood is really good. It goes in a variety of different decks right now too, going in every Silver Surfer list that you'll ever see, but also some of those Cersei lists. Oh, yeah. How's Cersei doing? Not great. Wow. Cersei really fell from grace here. 6 copies played, only 1 person able to grab a single win across those 6 copies. What was the worst win rate card? I saw Rogue down there also with 60%. Oh, I guess there's a bunch of 0%ers too. But yeah, other than the 0% cards, Cersei and Rogue, and all of these 0% cards only have 1 or 2 copies. So Cersei and Rogue, the worst cards right now in Marvel Snap. Wow, a huge fall from grace. Also, a huge fall from grace here for Carnage, that had really respectable results last week in all of those Phoenix Force lists, but here is just not doing great at all. And Snowguard and Loki, we also saw in that original tweet. Actually, Loki might have the biggest fall from grace here, having 5 copies in last week's top 8 and now a 30% win rate with, I guess, an interesting sort of metagame correction. And, I called Silver Surfer a more good stuff deck, and compared to Phoenix Force, Loki is definitely more of just playing good cards. But you know what, let me zoom in on this screen just a little bit here, because we don't need to see all of this stuff at the top. We could go for a little bit more. Oh, that's probably what I have in that background tab, but let me just do this for now. That way I get a little bit more data on the screen. And I think that Loki is or those Phoenix Force lists are more linear than the Surfer list, but Surfer is still kind of linear in that if you don't draw specifically the Surfer, then you're not going to have as big of a payoff. Now, Loki lists do play some of their own 3-cost cards, which is why Surfer doesn't feel that bad into them. Things like Agent Coulson and the cards from Snowguard can get pumped up by Silver Surfer when you steal that. But overall, yeah, it just looks like a huge metagame correction must be that is really pushing out these Loki lists. What else did I want to touch on here? Yeah, not great results overall from Thanos, but, oh, that's right, the Baron Zemo, I thought was, yeah, kind of like a fall from grace for this. A lot of these really not seeing too much play. And then honestly, Shang-Chi could be argued as one of the worst cards in the tournament. But I think that sorting by copies played is actually a really good indicator of like metagame overall and what you want to tech against or avoid tech against. So like, you definitely want to dodge Shang-Chi. It was in 35 games across the tournament. You also probably want to try to dodge Shadow King and Red Guardian and Nocturne as much as possible. I talked last week about not really wanting to play Magic. We see that here with both of the Silver Surfer lists being Magic-less Silver Surfer lists, and the ramp decks also eschewing playing Magic in favor of other ramp with Hope Summers and Jubilee and Electro and Thanos. But that is one other thing that I think is really important to look at. Let me also just sort by win rate one more time and just take a look at some of the best cards. And I did the same thing twice. I'm going to put them at the top of the screen because that's where they belong. And 2 cards with 100% win rates. So obviously only one person was playing Negasonic Teenage Warhead and Supergiant. And I maybe like want to go back into, we'll look at like game scene numbers and just talk about, okay, this combo right here, Negasonic, Supergiant, and Cosmo. What are these cards good against? I said I was going to do that and I kind of forgot to do so, to be honest. But these are cards that as a whole, like, nobody is playing except for the winner of the tournament, which is obviously able to find a really good hole in the metagame for them. We also saw not too many people playing, well, only one person playing all of this Blink package, and I guess only one person playing Bounce Monkey as well. But yeah, that was pretty good for them, which probably means that it's underrepresented. When I was talking about Blink earlier in the video, I was kind of struggling for like, why did everybody stop playing this deck? I know that Leech got nerfed, but Blink itself is still a really strong card, and I think that this is representative of the fact that more people should be trying to play it. Maybe I'm wrong that more people should be trying to play Nokia as well and America. I think that there's other better things to do, but what have you. So let's take a look at the most played cards as a representation of the metagame here. And so Cosmo and Supergiant, they do stop Mockingbird. Interestingly, Supergiant like protects your opponent from setting up Mockingbird and thus making it cheaper. We also saw one really clutch thing from the Supergiant list. No Mobius, which I thought was really interesting. Kind of the people playing cards that are good, cards that Mobius is good against. Okay, the people that played Fasta, I already said this earlier, the people who played Fastas are also the ones that play Mobius. It's like the ones that know how good making your cards cheaper is also respect that by playing Mobius themselves. But in this winning list, we also see no ways to reduce costs. No Mobius in this list, but also completely dodges Mobius. I'm sorry, it's got Mockingbird in it. Okay, but other than Mockingbird, completely dodges Mobius, which I think is a really important part of like reading the metagame. We're not seeing as much like Serra. We don't see any Ravona in the top 8 as well, with only one copy of Mobius itself in the top 4. I meant to say top 4. But still, like, these are definitely things to keep in mind if you're looking to get like one level above the metagame. Similarly, the top deck does not care about Shadow King or Nocturne, just completely dodges all of that. Definitely trying to be on the more reactive side of things. Helps you for not playing into as much hate, but definitely worth noting. And then Cosmo actually does get played in some Loki lists, but Cosmo also stops Loki and of course stops things like Brood and Silver Surfer and anything that Absorbing Man is looking to hit. 16 copies of Silver Surfer. That is pretty incredible. I mean, let's just go to last week's event right here. Control F, Silver Surfer, 4 copies. And I'm telling you, the weeks before that, we saw some weeks with no copies. Oh, I think I just got confused. 6 copies of Silver Surfer, 16 games. Yeah, that's right. Still, a lot more Silver Surfer, a 50% increase in Silver Surfer. Doesn't seem like that much, 6 copies across 53 players, I think, played in this event. But still, compared to some weeks in the past few months where we've seen 0 players play Silver Surfer. So, bringing the Cosmo for that, obviously, really good. And we also have Cosmo for Blob, Cosmo for some of the things like, I see the Hood, I don't see Annihilus though, super high up. You can also Cosmo a Cannonball and an Ultron or a Cersei. So a lot of cool uses for it, and let's just throw that on the screen to end the video here. Definitely a good showing here from Claire with Supergiant control. Let me know what you think about this list and the other decks and overall metagame that I talked about today. But for today, that's going to be it for me. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'm NoLucksGiven. Peace.